This podcast is brought to you by the Creation Academy Honors Program, an apologetics learning experience designed to teach, train, and inspire others to become strong defenders of the Christian faith and biblical creation. Launching early 2019, the program offers video and audio training with downloadable course workbooks, expert interviews, and exclusive Q&A sessions with leading creation scientists and apologists, quarterly ebooks covering a wide variety of subject matter, and even a private Facebook community where you'll fellowship and interact with a like-minded community of believers. If you want to be notified when the program goes live and even help us design the experience from the ground up, head on over to www.jointca.co today and sign up for the waitlist. You'll get early access to the private Facebook group for free as a thank you for joining. All right, you're listening to the Steve Schramm Show. Thank you for joining us this week. Want to give you the second part of our interview with Josh Shoemaker and Dr. Gary Braness. These guys have edited a book recently called God and the World of Insects. We began talking about it last week, and I trust you really enjoyed that. I know I did. And so this week we're going to pick up with part 2 of that interview. All right, we're going to get right into it. If you like what we're doing here on the show, I'd encourage you to go rate and review the show in iTunes. Wherever you listen to podcasts, you should be able to get to a link to be able to rate the show in some way. And subscribe, of course, if you're not subscribed to the show to get the latest episode each week when it comes out. Please do. We talk about all things creation and apologetics here, and we love what we do. So be sure to tune in each week as we discuss these issues so that you can be better prepared to defend your faith. All right. Again, go back and listen to last week's episode in order to get the full context. But without further ado, here is the remainder of our interview with Josh Shoemaker and Dr. Gary Braness on God and the World of Insects. So we're just kind of moving right through it here. I mean, and so in chapter 4, PhDs Paul Nelson and Ann Gager, they did a chapter together, and basically they eviscerate any evolutionary naturalistic explanation for the process of metamorphosis. Can you tell us a little bit more about this process and why specifically it screams design?
Sure. Yeah. Well, first off, I would point your listeners, if they haven't seen it, there is a video that was produced entitled Metamorphosis, where the video goes into some detail and with some nice animation and discusses the whole process. And I would highly encourage anyone who's interested in this to take a look and check out that video. And, like I said, just a fantastic video that illustrates the process. But really, there's some key components to it. And when you're talking about an insect, and a lot of insects go through different types of metamorphosis, but what a butterfly metamorphosis is a complete metamorphosis. And so that's where you have an egg that goes to a larva, to a pupa, to an adult. And really, probably the most amazing part of that is what happens in the pupa or the chrysalis. You really have to have built into that whole system 2 body plans in advance. Because what happens is once that larva stage becomes a pupa, a lot of the larval tissues will actually die and actually disappear. And some of those components are then recycled and become something totally different than they were before. There's some cells that are there from the very beginning that are not even used in the caterpillar. Like they just kind of sit there and they don't do anything. And then when it goes into a pupa stage, it then those cells activate and then finally do something. But I mean, there's things that happen. You have one stage of the insect where it starts off as this caterpillar, and then before it's a butterfly, when it's in this pupa stage, there's in the caterpillar there's no proboscis. It doesn't have any long legs. And one of the most remarkable things, and we'll get to this later maybe, is what Wendy talks about, Wendy Billick in her chapter on bees, and how fascinating compound eyes are. there's no compound eyes present in that larval stage of that butterfly. And yet it goes in the pupa and it pops out, and now it's got compound eyes. It has a different type of eyes in the larval stage, and now it's got compound eyes. And so it's really, really fascinating that this process happens. And so what they talk about in the chapter and really in that video where it lays it out excellent is how that this whole process just doesn't make any sense. I mean, there's no explanation for it, for why something like this would occur. And even like some things have been postulated that maybe there's this evolved over years because there was limited food supply, and so the insect needed to have two different food sources, for example. But there's no evidence for this. Even the evolutionary biologist texts that talk about insect and this development, if they postulate or suggest that this is a possible theory, the ones that I've read will then say, yeah, there's not really any evidence for this yet, though, so we still need to look at it more.
Right.
So there's not really an adequate explanation for how metamorphosis developed. Again, there are some things that have been put forth, but all of those are debated, and again, not really an adequate explanation. And so that's really what they discuss is, and why they say that there's such evidence for design here, is because all of these challenging components, and yet there's no adequate explanation. So I would just encourage people, if they haven't seen it, to watch that video, because it really goes into a lot of detail.
Yeah, we'll put a link to that in the notes, and I mean, just I think this might be a good place even to plug the book. I mean, there's some good images and things like that all throughout the book that kind of show some of the different things going on in these processes. And it's really amazing the different stages that they have to go through, and you just wonder, you're just asking yourself the whole time, how could this possibly arise naturalistically? And everybody seems perplexed by that, and for good reason. So it's definitely a good read. It was one of my favorite chapters in the book. Of course, I like Paul Nelson anyway. I'm a fan of his, and so and he and Anne, the way they wrote this chapter, I thought it was absolutely great, and really took the evolutionary paradigm to task on that particular point. So absolutely great. So get the book. Hey, get the book. It's not that expensive, and it's totally, you need to see the images and the pictures and the explanations. I mean, we're talking about it here, but we're not doing it justice. I mean, the guys and girls who wrote this particular, their individual chapters, they did such a great job, and they're experts in that. That's why they wrote the chapter. So
that's right.
So you definitely need to go ahead and grab that. All right, Gary, let's talk about ants. You tell us in there, and you tell us a lot. So let's start with that. There is a lot to learn about ants that you've given us. But in there, I found one thing that just really, man, it was so interesting to me. And you're free to talk about more of this if you want to. But I definitely wanted to bring out this thing about ant colony optimization, or ACO. Now, you claim that this uses data from the cooperative behavior that we find in ant colonies to manage traffic flow on our streets. Now, if this doesn't, I mean, if you can't pull a design application out of the, if you can't pull something out of the insect world and apply it to the human world and say that there's no design there, to me, that just seems completely improbable. So how does this particular thing work? Why is it so effective, and whatever else you want to tell us about ants?
Right. Yes. Well, no, this is a real fascinating area. It's a new area of study, basically. The computer scientists and engineers in the early 1990s, apparently they got together with some biologists or entomologists and started looking at the behavior of ants, how they forage for food, how they travel on trails and so forth, and started thinking, well, we can learn from the ant and apply that to a lot of practical problems that we're facing. And so they've made great advances. There's national conferences on this. There's a lot of research papers. A lot of it's theory yet, but there is also a lot of applied uses for this combination of knowledge. So it kind of goes back to the ants, where it's amazing how they forage for food. They're out there. A lot of the work is done with Argentine ants, leafcutter ants, other species. But if we focus on Argentine ants, they communicate by using chemicals. Their sight isn't that great, but through chemicals called pheromones, and specifically a trail pheromone, the ants will lay this down basically by dragging their abdomen across the surface. Once the scout ants are out and they're foraging at random, but once they find a reliable food source, they lay down this pheromone as they make a beeline or direct line back to the colony, back to the nest. And that encourages other ants to follow. And if it remains a good food source, it's reinforced as the ants travel back and forth with this pheromone. The pheromone will evaporate very quickly. So once the food source is depleted, that trail goes away, and then they focus on other areas. And it's reported too that they will locate food that's closer to them to save energy and build up that pheromone, as opposed to food that is much more distant, takes more energy. So they're very efficient in how they forage for food. And so the engineers and software folks were able to apply a lot of that in mathematical equations, or algorithms, they're called. I talked to my son about this recently. He's an engineer. I know the entomology side. When it comes to the engineering, it gets pretty complex. But basically, they use the ant model in these mathematical equations, and can basically simulate how ants are locating food. So it has direct applications in traffic management and things like that.
Wow.
Yeah, and I think this is really an exciting area when we think about where people now live. I've in the last month, I've had to drive through LA on a couple of occasions. And well, Josh can talk more about this. He lives down there in Southern California, but it's just it's a challenge to get through the city almost any time of day now. And that's true of all large cities across the world. By 2030, it's estimated that about 60% of the world's population will live in cities. So the traffic is just going to continue to get worse and worse. And so by applying principles we learned from ant behavior to routing and so forth, it really can help in that area. Just a couple examples. There's a lot of this has been done in Europe. It really got started there. It's expanding to the US as well. But there's a company in Switzerland, which a large supermarket chain, and then also another pasta maker in Italy, where they have this program. It's called Ant Route, developed by a company that uses this technology. And within like 15 minutes, they can plan the best route for up to 1,200 trucks that they send out every day.
Whoa.
And to make it much more efficient on how they make each stop and avoid the traffic and things like that. And they have to reroute this every day, because every day is the conditions are different. And so that's just one example. In France, they're looking at their train system and trying to make that more efficient as far as keeping the train on time. And I read recently too an article was published in scientific journal, where in China they've recently adopted that there'll be no more gated communities. And the feeling is that by eliminating the gated communities, it will improve their traffic flow. As China is growing, they're getting more and more cars, and the traffic is just terrible in their major cities. So they're using this ant colony optimization to predict or estimate how much improvement they can have in traffic flow by changing this policy throughout the country. So I could go on and on about that, but I didn't go into a lot of detail in the chapter on this, but it's an area that folks are really interested. They could dig in deeper. There's more and more information on it.
Yeah, and just maybe for some of our listeners to reflect on this area, I guess this would be some form of biomimicry, right? I mean, I guess that this is essentially
Yeah.
what this is.
Bioinspiration. It'd be like bioinspiration. Yeah.
Bioinspiration. Yeah, that works. We're drawing things from the natural world and applying them to
Yeah.
daily processes that we use as humans. And there's there's so many angles you could go to talk about this, like why the evolutionary explanations, why don't we just know how to do that? Aren't we supposed to be the perfect form? But anyway, I don't want to get into all that. We could talk for hours
Yeah.
just down that rabbit trail.
Well, the thing is too, Steve, I mean, that's one of the most amazing things about when you look at insects and what we've been able to apply technology wise from them. It seems, if you just do a quick Google search, this happens all the time. I mean, there's new research coming out based on the eye of this particular insect, or based on the cuticle of this particular insect. We've developed this new technology that helps airplanes do this.
Wow.
It all the time. There is so much stuff, and it amazes me that the examples just one after another, and people can easily look to that and say, wow, we're taking the example of something in creation and learning from it. And that's because it's so awesome.
Yeah. Oh man. Yeah. No, I love that. And so it just kind of goes to show how we can use all these different aspects from the world that God placed us in. Of course, God gave us dominion over this. We realize in the early chapters of Genesis that we do have a role as caretakers over these insects and over the animals and over God's creation. And as a matter of fact, we're going to talk about that here in just a minute. But the point being that we can study and we can learn from them. I think there's application there. We live in a world that was designed in such a way that it could be studied, that we could learn from even the smallest insects. And just when we think that we have got everything all figured out, just when we think that we are, the smart guys on the block, it turns out that in some instances we're only so smart because we can apply the tools that the Creator has built in to even the smallest of insects. You talk about bees. I was reading that chapter, and I had to look up some of these images of bees that are like between 1 and 3 millimeters in size, and that was one of the things that was talked about in that chapter was the intricacies of the way that bees process information in their brains. And it was like this tiny little, you'd have to almost have a microscope basically to see this little bee, and just to think about the processes that are going on inside of that little creature. To think that there was not a designer behind that, it just blows my mind. This is great, man. This is all such good stuff. Speaking of bees, let's talk a little bit about them, Josh. So Dr. Billick wrote this chapter on bees, chapter 6. She gives enough astounding facts here just to make anybody's head spin. As a matter of fact, I made this little note to myself that I think the book is worth the price of admission just to learn about the bees. I think she did a fabulous job on this chapter, talking about so many different aspects. She talks about their vision. She talks about the way their brains process information. She talks about their foraging techniques. It just on and on and on. There's so many things. I guess I'm going to kind of have to ask you to narrow it down, though. Like, of all the amazing things she mentioned, do you have a favorite aspect of the design of bees?
Well, first I'd have to say that I completely echo what you said. When I first read her draft, I was just as fascinated as you. I'd read some things about bees and what they could do, but it is astonishing the number of things, recognizing faces, counting.
Yeah.
The things that bees can do, it is truly astonishing. My particular favorite, though, happens to be the waggle dance. And the waggle dance is something that bees do to communicate to other bees where food is. And this process is so fascinating that when the original person that discovered this, Carl von Frisch, when he discovered it, originally people thought, no, you're wrong. It's totally wrong. And so he had a lot of skeptics. Now, what's great about it is as people started looking into it, they realized, no, he's right. And he eventually won the Nobel Prize. So, but how this process works and what's so fascinating is, so a bee goes out, it finds food, and then it has to remember where that is, right? So it goes back to the hive, and then it has to remember. And it does this little dance. It's like a pattern of where it moves around kind of in a figure eight, and it shakes and vibrates its abdomen while it's doing this. And it communicates to the other bees in the hive the distance, and it can communicate up to several miles. And that the duration of that vibration communicates how distant the food source is. Now, the angle, it actually does the dance at a certain angle as well, and the angle communicates the direction. But it's not, what I think is so fascinating is the bee doesn't like point and say, so when it does a waggle dance, that angle isn't like pointing towards where the food source is. It's actually much more complex than that. It actually points in the direction in relation to the sun. And what's so fascinating about that is, so for example, if a bee goes out to a food source and it comes back to a hive, and it's moving around the hive's dark, it doesn't have access to sunlight, the sun moves in the sky, right? While that's happening, as time passes, the sun's moving in the sky. The bee, when it decides to communicate to the other bees where that food source is, it adjusts for that clock of the sun. So where the sun has moved into the sky, and it adjusts and it does its waggle dance, so it points them to where they should fly in the direction based on where the sun is in the sky. And Wendy talks all about how they can see polarized light and UV light and how they can navigate. And so she gets into the details there. But all of that is important to that waggle dance that it communicates to the other bees. And what I find really fascinating about this is there's some debate, but most of what I've read would agree that, and would actually call this a language. And in fact, evolutionary biologist James Gould says that the bee waggle dance is second only to human language in terms of the amount of information capacity that it has. And I think it's I can't remember if it's him or another, but there's somewhere out there that I read that it's like up to 40 million unique messages can be communicated through the bee waggle dance. Now, that's a lot.
Yeah, good night. Wow. Just through that waggle dance.
Yeah.
Not to mention all the other things. I mean, goodness, her discussion on the eyes was enough to blow my mind.
Yeah,
and tracking the sun in the sky. I mean, these are all things that you just never think about. I mean, how would you communicate exactly where the sun is in the sky to tell somebody else where to go get their food? I mean, you're trying to tell them where it is so that you can go get, find the nearest, I don't know what kind of food y'all have out there. McDonald's, I'm sure you have that. Like, I'm just sitting there thinking, wow, how amazing that the way that God built that in to be able to communicate to them. So there's a video you said that we could go and watch.
Yeah, I'll share that with you so you can put that up. And there's several good videos, but there's one in particular I think would be worth sharing. So
great. And I'll just maybe I'll throw in another tip, and it might be because I've got three little boys, 3 under 3, and so this might be a tip for the parents, but. The Bee movie from a few years ago, I think it has a little bit of a representation of this in it. Now, I'm sure it's not scientifically accurate, but if you want to maybe communicate to your little children, even the way that God designed some of these creatures, maybe you show them the Bee movie. I don't know, maybe that because I think they do the waggle dance in there a little bit. So,
Steve, I watched that movie recently with the grandkids. I love that movie.
Really.
Really cool, yeah.
Well, there is the endorsement from a PhD entomologist right there.
Very enjoyable. Yeah.
On the Bee movie. That is great. Absolutely great. All right. So get the book and nothing else for the chapter on bees. I mean, I think it was absolutely fascinating. Okay, so now we're moving on here, skipping a few chapters on to chapter 10. If you want to know what happens in chapter 7 through 9, get the book. But I want to talk about chapter 10 real quick because the both of you and Dr. Porter all co-wrote this particular chapter. And what you do in there is give us 4 significant contributions that insects make in considering God's purpose for insects. Why create insects? And what you do is you say that, number one, they help maintain a balanced ecosystem. Two, they can be used by people as an instrument to improve agriculture. Three, they're a source of food for people, which is interesting. And four, they're used by God to accomplish his will. Now, some of those are a little more clear-cut than others. Could you guys possibly just, I don't know, maybe talk amongst yourself, but could you unpack each of these very briefly? You don't have to go into too much detail, but what do each of those things, how do they manifest? What do they look like?
Why don't you start, Gary?
Okay, well, I can start with the first point then. I guess that was about to help maintain the balance in the ecosystem. Well, I think that gets back to a comment I made earlier where beetles are everywhere and do everything.
Yeah.
And that's true for many insects too. They're just really a significant part of the ecosystem. They feed on other organisms and they are fed upon, so they're an important food source for many organisms. And they just are, they're everywhere. So they're just vital to the overall health of our environment and in the ecosystem. So.
Yeah, and I mean, what maybe you guys can help me with this, but when it says balance, I mean, is there any more unpacking to do on that word? I mean, is there, if there was too much of one thing, would that cause? Maybe give an example of that. I don't know if there was too much of, if there was too many ants, then all the beetles would die. I don't know. I mean, is there some kind of intricate balance that's maintained there because of the particular insects that we do see?
Yeah, I believe there is a balance that's maintained as long as humans don't interfere too much with that balance.
Interesting, yeah.
And just the environment in general, weather conditions, climate, all of that can interfere. So, it basically just moves along terrifically as long as we don't interfere too much. And if we were to lose a whole order of insects like the beetles or whatever, it would have a drastic impact on our environment and living conditions here. So.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this quote, I think it is in y'all's book, but I've heard it elsewhere as well. Something about if all the humans were gone, the insects could go along just fine. But if some of the insects were to die out, then we would have a problem.
Right.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. What about the second thing? They can be used as an instrument to improve agriculture. So, okay, so on one hand, we have insects who are improving the way that we deliver things overseas. We send out 1,200 trucks at a time, apparently, and we can use ant information to help these guys navigate. But the other side is that we can improve our agriculture. How does that work?
Yeah. I'll take this one. I think one of the things about just about nature in general is that it's understandable, it's orderly, so we can see how the processes work, and I think that speaks to the design again, back to that. But because it's understandable and orderly, we're able to take advantage and work the insects, if you will, in some cases. So I think Gary talked about it earlier, where some beetles, and they're not the only one, other insects are used as well, and arachnids, Steve, in biological control. And so we will release certain insects to help aid us in biological control. So that can be used in agriculture there. Another way that's very common, and I think a lot of people are familiar with, is bees. And that bees will be, you might see them driving on the truck down the road sometime, and bees are moved around, at least honeybees are used to pollinate different crops. And so we've taken advantage of that behavior and use them to pollinate and to aid in our agriculture. Up in your area, Gary, what is it? Every year they bring in, I forget what it is, but like half the bees in the United States come to pollinate the almonds, something like that.
Yes, we wouldn't enjoy our almonds if it weren't for the honeybees that are brought in on trucks from Minnesota and all over the country. It's been bloom season here in the San Joaquin Valley near where I live. Very important.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to spoil the movie, but back to the bee movie too. One of the key features of that movie is that they basically, the circumstances work out such that the bees essentially stop working, and what you basically see is, and it's, of course, it's done in kind of a hyperbolic way, but and it's an animated children's movie, but what you end up seeing is that the bees stop working, and essentially the world shuts down, and it's,
Yeah.
I think, very metaphorical, but at the same time, it's very literal too. I mean, what would happen if the bees stopped doing their work? Well, you wouldn't live in the world that we do. And so maybe that's just another example of that. All right, I don't know which one wants to take this one, but what about this? They're a food source for people. There was some astounding facts that I read on that point in the book. It's not just that there are people in the tribes in third world countries who are eating these things for sustenance. That's not what we're talking about here. I think we all might be a little bit surprised at how many insects we consume. Who wants to talk about that?
Well,
Jerry, you want to take that one too? Yeah.
Well, you want to take that, or you want me to?
No, I think you. Yeah,
Okay.
go for it.
I'll take this one, and you can take the last one.
Oh, perfect.
I got in the section here, but yeah, I mean, insects are delicious. Chocolate-covered ants, mealworms, crickets, that kind of thing. I got some for Christmas from my grandkids.
Wow.
There was only one of the grandchildren that was willing to eat it with me. The others chickened out. But no, with our growing population and problems with starvation around the world, the consumption of insects for added protein can be real helpful.
Wow.
And when raised properly, there are a number of different insects that they can be safely consumed and will add to that protein. Right now, there's a lot of insects that are raised for animal feed and also for bait and things like that. In fact, there was a cricket farm here. It just burned down, unfortunately.
Oh, no.
Located near where I live, and they raised thousands and thousands of crickets and were in business for many years. Hopefully they'll rebuild. But so yeah, it's in some areas it's becoming more and more accepted as a supplement to our food. Sometimes it can be incorporated into recipes and ground up like flour or whatever, and then not even not an issue then, as long as you don't know they're in there. If you're really concerned about that, but
yeah. Well, and to expand on that, I think one of the things I read in there said that to a certain extent, it's inevitable that they're going to wind up in the food supply that we have, right?
Yes, absolutely true. Despite our best efforts to keep pests out of our food in storage and transport and in use packaging, there's actually a lower limit that is acceptable in our food. And so actually every one of us unknowingly will eat perhaps some fragment of an insect.
Yeah, there's some foods in particular too. Like if you like cereal or chocolate, there's a few that have some high levels that are allowed in them. And I mean,
had Frosted Flakes and Fruit Loops this morning. You're killing me, guys.
Oh, there you go. Yeah. So you should get your boost of protein. Yeah.
That's right. It's just a boost of protein. It's not bad for you.
Yeah.
Wow.
But it's at very low levels. Very low level.
Very low. Okay. Well, that's comforting.
The management industry really works hard at trying to keep that as low as possible, and they do a good job.
They do.
All right. Well, that's great. Yeah, that's awesome. All right. What about? Well, I don't know how awesome it is. I say that.
You gotta try some, Steve.
I guess I will say this. In reading this book, I have increased my appreciation for the world of insects now and for God. I don't know that I'm too thrilled about eating them. I once heard one of those things. Now back on the arachnids, all right. Now I once heard something that in your lifetime you eat like 17 spiders or something like that because they crawl in your mouth while you're sleeping. I don't know if there's any truth to that.
No.
But I heard that one time, and I was diagnosed with sleep apnea and had to start sleeping with a CPAP machine. And I thought, thank God, I'll wear a mask every night. And I won't have to worry about eating them spiders.
You've been saved.
No, that's not true. I mean, there are some things you hear about insects, like if you've ever heard stories of cockroaches crawling in people's ears, that does really happen. But the spiders in people's mouths is not.
Oh, well, thank goodness. You really, really saved me there. Okay, so what about the last one then? They're used by God to accomplish his will. Now, I don't think there's any doubt that can happen, but how does that happen?
Yeah, well, so just real quick, I want to just kind of point out, so we talk about the 4 here, but certainly these aren't the only 4. I mean, there's other things, for example, and we talked about it earlier, the fact that insects can be used by us to learn, so that we have this bio-inspiration. So that could be another purpose of them. And in fact, there was initially in the first drafts of the book, there was a proposal for a chapter that was going to talk about how the purpose of insects is so that it reminds us of our mortality, it points us to God, but what ultimately that chapter ultimately ended up dealing more with the problem of evil and less about insects, so we ended up not including it. But so there are other purposes for insects outside of these 4 too. So I just wanted to make sure and highlight that real quick. But back to the 4th one, how God uses insects to accomplish his will. I mean, I think we can easily look straight to Scripture and see there's clear examples of that. The plagues of Exodus, where God uses different insects to accomplish his will there. He's taking these creatures that he's created and using them for his purpose. And so, and Exodus isn't the only time when that happens. There's a plague also referred to in Joel. And I think there's a couple of other times in the Old Testament where God uses insects to deliver judgment, even on Israel. And so there's clear examples that we have where God is taking advantage of the natural behavior of an insect in this grand way that accomplishes his purposes.
Hey, and I'll add to that. I like the way you said that, where he takes the natural behavior of insects to accomplish his purposes, because I think one of those purposes is teachability. Let's even talk about that. In the Proverbs, we are to look to the ant. We are to look to arachnids like the spiders. We are to look to other animals in the animal kingdom and learn from them. And I just made this connection in my mind, but I'm thinking like, I often talk about being in apologetics. I often talk about with people that when they're trying to be really careful, they might, and they're trying to defend their position, philosophically, they might be very careful about their words, but their actions always betray their words, the way that they interact with God's world. And so I think this way that we have seen during the course of this conversation, so many ways that we directly learn from the insect world and apply it to things in our own human experience. And ultimately, the Bible told us to do this first. We were told all the way back in the writings and in the Proverbs, and I think it's the late 20s, maybe chapter 26 or 27, I can't remember exactly which, but there's a whole section in there that deals with different ways that we can learn from watching even insects and spiders and other forms in the animal kingdom. There are other comparisons to other animals in the Bible about that how we can learn and that we should be doing things in the way that they do. Also in Proverbs, it talks about, like guys like Dave Ramsey use this, talking about getting out of debt and stuff, but the way to act like a gazelle runs from the hand of a hunter, things like that. And so the animal kingdom, broadly speaking, we're told in the Bible that we can learn from that. And I think that's a marvelous way that God uses insects and other animals to accomplish his will. Ultimately, is that we can learn from them. He teaches us through these other creations that he has made. And where do we find it first? In the Word of God. That's usually how it goes. You guys agree with that? I mean, was that a fair assessment?
Yeah.
Yeah. Perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, all right. So, last but not least, our time here is almost to a close. And, this is unfortunate because we could probably talk for hours about this book. There's so much. I mean, we have not scratched the surface. I mean, to say that we have given you 5% of what's in the book would probably be a drastic overstatement. It's really, really been great. But before our time is over for today, I do want to talk about our role as caretaker over these insects. I was just having a conversation with a guy, and I won't mention any names, but I work with him. And he, not for the first time, but for the first time in a very, very long time, went to church last weekend. And he's, right now, he's definitely kind of agnostic, atheist. I mean, he's certainly not a believer, but he's open. And he was talking about how he didn't know that he necessarily agreed with the particular pastor's rendering of how human beings are the apex of creation, etc. Of course, we know as Bible believers that we're made in the image of God. Insects are not made in the image of God. But he said something. He said, my view is that all life is precious. And I said, well, that's my view too. As a matter of fact, I am reading a book right now about how God relates to the world of insects. And, there's a whole chapter on there about insect conservation, but also pest management. And of course, this is something that you guys, I'm sure, know a lot about. So, I want to know, and maybe I can relate some of this information to him that I want others to know. What does it look like to be a steward over creatures that literally define the word pest? We used pest management. We use that word because that's kind of more of a technical term for, the exterminator, but a lot of people don't really use that term anymore. They say pest management, but the word pest, when we think of a pest, that has a certain kind of connotation. And yet, not only do we learn from these creatures, but God tells us, that we're to steward his creation and take care of them. So, there's important ethical considerations, I'm sure, that we need to be looking at when it comes to controlling insect populations. And then, of course, there's the whole thing about insect conservation. Can you guys maybe speak to that a little bit?
Sure. Well, first of all, I think I just point out that while a lot of people are familiar with maybe insect pests, the vast majority of insects are not pests. That's a very small group of insects. But we see them more, I guess, because they're the ones that are in our homes or maybe impact us. But the vast majority of insects are not pests.
Good. Okay.
So yeah. Now with regard to just general principles on being caretakers, I think the Bible's clear that God cares about nature. He calls it very good, and there are numerous passages, and we talk about these in the book, where that point us to the fact that God cares about nature. He has given us charge over it, but he cares about it. And so what that means is we don't wantonly go out there and destroy it, right? But we have a responsibility to it rather. And so there is a sense which and you point out Dave Ramsey, we watch our finances. I think it's a similar analogy here, that we need to watch over the earth in the same way. That doesn't mean we worship it. That doesn't mean we do anything and put it ahead of God in any sense or way.
Right.
But we owe a responsibility to it because it's something that he's created and entrusted to us. And so with regards to insects, and we can talk about conservation in a moment, but I think the question often comes up then, well, how does that impact us when we're talking about insects that might hurt us? For example, the mosquito is the most deadly animal, because a lot of people don't realize insects are animals too, but they are animals. The mosquito is the most deadly animal there is. Wow. And there are insects as well. Cockroaches vector bacteria. They're one of the major causes of asthma, and so there are definitely some insects that really have a negative impact on us if we're not doing preventative measures. And so I think that that's where pest control and things like that are very, very appropriate. So, as a general rule, we would be trying to take care and protect the creation. But when it pits, when there are insects that actually have a negative impact on us, then I think the Bible is also clear that human life, as you mentioned, being made in the image of God, has a value that is higher than insect life.
Yeah, I like that. And maybe I was just thinking of a scriptural analogy, maybe some way to relate this to people. And I don't know, the analogy might break down, or you might correct me, but, I almost think about how when we talk about our relationship to the government and things like that, kind of, I think the standard practice that the Bible endorses, and I can't give you chapter and verse here, but I know it's out there, is basically obey the government until the government tells you to disobey God. I think that's your first commitment, is to obey God, and then of course you're to obey the government. But we don't want to violate God's law. And maybe this is an analogy that can be drawn. We don't want to needlessly harm creatures. We don't want to harm creatures at all. I think if there is a way to responsibly manage a population of pests or of insects in general, then we do that. When it comes to the point that they harm, they could be causing us harm, we know that as being made in God's image, our responsibility first is to human life because of its intrinsic spiritual value. Then we take the appropriate measures, all while being conscious of and mindful of what we're doing.
I think I think there is an instructive passage in the Old Testament. It's not directly insects, but in Deuteronomy 22, I've got it here, verse 6. It says, "If you come across a bird's nest beside the road, either in a tree or on the ground, and the mother is sitting on the young or on the eggs, do not take the mother with the young. You may take the young, but be sure to let the mother go, so that it may go well with you and you may have a long life." And so I think the principle there is, there are certain, to thrive, and for us, whether it's food or whatnot, that there are certain things that God has provided for us. But at the same time, we need to recognize, so in that instance there, letting the mother go so she could go produce more, we need to recognize that we can't just go out and damage and destroy the ecosystem and the world that God has given us. So that we need to kind of think about all these things in a larger scale and discern, when it's appropriate to do, for example, the pest control, and when, for example, it's appropriate to take the opposite approach and do our best to conserve insects.
Talk a little bit more about the conservation aspect of it before we wrap up.
Yeah, and actually, I think this is one area where we as Christians have really good reason for what we just discussed for insect conservation. I mean, our motivation to go out and help conserve insects, and if there are threatened populations as such, our motivation comes from the fact that we are caretakers, that we have a responsibility. And there's also a component of it that maybe we want to pass on these insects to our children, and so there's that element as well. But first and foremost, we're caretakers, and we've been given charge of taking care of the world. Now, so we have a purpose here, and we do this as we discussed because it's God's creation, and we're watching over it in a sense. Now, this is where it gets interesting, though. For an evolutionary biologist, why would you do conservation? The only real reason that one could give would be utility. We might one day discover an insect gives us a cure to cancer, for example. And actually, there is some promising areas there. But once, for example, once we find that cure, then from an evolutionary biologist standpoint, there's no reason to then say, hey, we need to maintain this life of this insect. They really can't offer a justification. Whereas the Christian, we have really strong reason, again, that goes back to that whole caretaker and responsibility that we have toward creation.
Wow. Yeah, and absolutely. And, I think the word that comes to mind here for me is stewardship. I've got Colossians 1:16 pulled up here, and it says this: "For by him all things, for by him were all things created that are in heaven." By the way, that says all things in this particular context. All, I think, certainly means all things that are in heaven, things that are in earth, visible and invisible, whether they be thrones, dominions, or principalities or powers. All things were created by him and for him. By him and for him. And I think that's very interesting. We remember that we are created finite, but God is infinite. He is the creator, and he didn't have to make anything. But Revelation, I think it's 4:11, tells us that he created everything for his glory. All things were made by him, but they were also made for him. And so we realize that what we're really doing is we are managing God's creation. I'll draw another analogy, and this is unrelated, but it is, I think, analogical. I'm currently in the middle of a book. It's a really good book on marriage, and it talks about treating your wife not as just, even as just a gift from God or just as your wife, but remembering that ultimately God is not just your father, but he's your father-in-law. I mean, when you take care of your wife, you are doing it in one sense to please her father. I mean, how respectful, do people try to be of the father-in-law in that kind of a typical married situation? You got to remember that you're caring for not just, your wife's creator, but your wife's father. You are doing that for him. And so I think that's another just analogy we could draw with scriptural support. It says, look, it's created by God. We're doing it for him. And that is our motivation. And I love what you said there. Other than just mere utility, what advantage is there to the evolutionary biologist or the person who wants to champion conservation? I don't think there's any justification for it, and no rational ultimate justification for it anymore. Right. So I think that's great, guys. Our time's gone, but it's been great. Thank you so much for joining us and for being willing to come on here and talk about this book.
Steve, thanks for inviting us. Yeah.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. It's my pleasure. And where can they get the book? Are they? I don't know if you guys have anything in the future going on that you want to care to talk about in terms of more materials that you might be producing. I'll just let you guys have the floor here for a minute. Just if there's any way we can get in contact with you and where you can buy the book.
Sure. Well, so the book's available Amazon, Christian Book, or you can go to the publisher's website, Lampion Press. So thanks for that, Steve. In terms of the future, Gary tossed around the idea of maybe doing a children's version of this book, some sort in the future. I don't know how serious that actually is, but I know both of us are really passionate about also communicating some of these messages in a more simplistic way to kids and doing some teaching there.
Yeah.
So maybe that'll come to fruition someday. I don't know, but right now there's no definitive plans. Sure. To do that.
Well, like I said, I have 3 under 3, so let me put in my bid for that. I'd like to see that happen. So y'all pray about that. But yeah, I would love to be able to have a more teachable version of this for my kids, to be able to show them. So the B movie is great, but might be helpful to watch, to have something a little more definitive and instructive than just the B movie. So.
Maybe
right,
they
guys. Go ahead.
Can be entomologists when they grow up.
Yeah, hey, maybe so. I would love that. I would love that. But as long as they always remember who it is that they are, that they're honoring. They need to honor God as creator. And
can I add one more quick thing before we close, Steve?
Oh, please do. Yes.
Yeah. So one of the things we haven't had a chance to talk about, but I've got to throw this in there is. So many of us, when we're little kids, we're fascinated by insects, and like you 3 under 3, if you haven't already seen it, you're going to see that they're going to be out there watching insects and seeing what they do, and there's just a fascination. And it seems like as we grow older, a lot of us have a tendency to drift away and from that fascination with insects, and maybe that's because of the exposure to some of the ones that we talked about, the cockroaches and ants, and we're like, ooh, or whatever attitude that we might develop. But again,
I've experienced that. So.
Yeah. such a small group of them. And really, if anyone out there is listening and is, I encourage your kids to look at insects, and they are so fascinating. And even you, go Google some pictures of beautiful insects. There are just some fascinatingly beautiful, gorgeous creatures, and it's just a wonderful place to study and to see the beauty of creation. And so I would encourage people to as an adult, if you've kind of lost that insect fascination, just go back and see if you can rekindle that a little bit.
I love that, man. I think that's absolutely great advice. And as I spend more time learning about God's creation, especially having read this book, I'm going to be more mindful of it. So you've impacted me and my family, if nothing else. So that's great.
Just to add to Josh's point there too, talking about beautiful insects, we have some beautiful color photographs in the center of the book as well. And we were very fortunate to get some real world-class photographers to contribute photos to the book. I'd mention Tom Myers for one. He does amazing work with his photography, and so we've got several of his photos in there, and so that adds to the book as well.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point that Gary just made. That the book has got this kind of center section in it with all these great images in there of even tiny insects and bigger insects, and it's great. Yeah, that's awesome. Good point. I'm glad you brought that up. All right, well, that finishes up our time with Dr. Braness and Brother Josh Shoemaker, and what an exciting time it's been. Don't forget to go buy their book. You can get it on Amazon. We will certainly have a link in the show notes, and of course anything that they mentioned throughout the podcast, things that I think we need to send you a link to, we're going to have those available for you to go to as well right there in the podcast notes so you can get to them. All right. I want to thank you again for spending this time with us, for learning more about God's creation. I'm telling you, we've barely scratched the surface on God and the world of insects. I mean, I think I mentioned this either it was either this week or last week. I can't remember, but I'm telling you, we probably didn't cover 5% of the book. There's so much more to learn, so much more to explore, and it's just a great read. I highly encourage you to get it. All right, let's end with a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for the opportunity, Lord, to come together each week to talk about you and to talk about you as our powerful creator, and to talk about this wonderful world that you created for us to explore and to study and to learn more about, Lord, and to learn from, even as we apply what we learn in nature to our daily lives. I pray now that you would enable us and empower us to learn from these creatures, as you even suggest that we do in your word. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Well, thank you for joining us this week here on the Steve Schramm Show. Again, we talk every week about apologetics and creation science, so we hope you join us. If you're a new listener, head over to steveschramm.com/defend. We want to send you something. We want to send you a free course, an email course on us, 4 lessons long, and I think you're going to learn a lot from it on the toughest objections to Christianity. All right, thank you again for joining us. Have a great week. See you next time.